Welcome everyone. My name is Mike Imhenna. Thanks so much for joining. I am honored to welcome our special guest, Professor Resat Kasaba. Professor Kasaba is an expert in the history and the politics of the Middle East and has taught undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Washington Jackson School of International Studies for over 30 years, where he also served as a school's director for 10 years. Professor Kasaba is also the recipient of the UW Distinguished Teaching Award. From 2017 to 2019, Professor Kasaba served as the president of the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. He is currently a board member of MESA, Middle East Studies Association of North America. He holds a PhD and an MA in sociology. His books include The Movable Empire, The Ottoman Empire and the World Economy, and Rethinking Modernity and National Identity in Turkey. He's currently researching the role of education in the formation of modern Turkish identity in the 20th century. Professor Kasaba or Resat, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think a good first question would be, you're Turkish, you grew up in modern day Turkey, and you're studying, you're studying the history of sort of Turkish politics and the history of the Ottoman Empire, but you study sociology. What drew you into sociology, and were you always expecting to sort of study the history of the Ottoman Empire, or was that a happy accident?
Something in between. First of all, I'm really impressed with what you've been doing in this network. It's just really a tremendous source for all of us now. So thank you, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of it. How I came to do what I do and how I do has a lot to do with the time that I grew up in Turkey. I'm not quite the 1960s generation, but came right after that. And those were really, really tumultuous times in Turkey. And those of us who were in high school and college in Turkey at the time couldn't but be affected by what was going on around us. I mean, it generated the social movements, student movements, the political uncertainty, repeated military interventions. I mean, all those things affected our lives and invariably led us to ask all kinds of questions. Many of my friends at the time who were interested in what was going on around them started to ask questions, why these things are happening and what is the best way of understanding these and what can we do. But of course, it wasn't really, at the time, it was more of a curiosity. The route to really take this as a vocation, as academic career, was a bit more, wasn't exactly planned, because it wasn't really, for our generation at the time, wasn't something that was done very commonly. I mean, we were thinking about these things, but we thought that the way to deal with them was to learn about them and to learn about, the background, the economics, etc. But the plan was basically to go and become a professional and hopefully make a contribution like that. So when I was at university in Turkey, at the Middle East Technical University, I was fortunate to have a number of teachers who were young and had come from Europe and from the United States. And they came with all kinds of new ways of thinking about society, history, and understanding these social dynamics. And once we were exposed to these new ways of thinking, I and several of my friends became very clear that there was more to do in terms of learning about this. So the next step was to go on beyond undergraduate and get a graduate degree. And the connection, when I think about it at the time, it could have been any kind of social science, because we thought there are economics to understand, history, sociology, anthropology. It just happened that one of my teachers in Turkey had good connections with what was then really an up and coming school of thought in historical sociology, led by Professor Emmanuel Wallerstein, who had just started a center at the State University of New York at Binghamton at the time. Now it's called Binghamton University. And that was more or less a direct route from Ankara in Turkey to Binghamton, New York into sociology. It wasn't so, the program that I was in and I ended up getting my degree in was not really strictly a traditional kind of a sociology department. It was, as I said, very historical in its orientation. And we were encouraged to learn foreign languages and do archival work and really think about things in a historical manner. I would just say one more thing about that school of thought, which shaped a lot of my early work, and my first book really posed questions about places like Turkey from a world historical context. So the question at the time became not necessarily Turkey or Brazil or Argentina or South Africa or the Caribbean, India being developed, underdeveloped. The question became, what was the place of these countries and regions in the world, and what was it about the global dynamics that really conditioned the social structures in these places? So it wasn't really thinking about these countries in a continuum being underdeveloped to developed, but it was thinking about them within a part of a global network. So, so that really, it is historical, but there are big historical questions that couldn't really necessarily be asked and answered strictly from a only historical perspective. So it was a broad social science perspective that I had at the time.
Yeah. So two questions. One, is it possible for you to speak louder or be a little closer to the mic? Because okay, perfect. The real question is, if I can sort of zoom back to your younger self when you're sort of starting to study in Turkey, and this is a question I've been meaning to ask somebody like you. Did you think you were growing up in the former Ottoman Empire? Was that a sort of a part of the psyche that you had? And a second part, as somebody who's well-traveled, do you feel like when you travel around, it's clear to you this used to be the Ottoman Empire when you go to, Lebanon, or you go to Egypt, or you go through Iraq or places, or Algeria, doesn't matter, or you think, yeah, this is very clearly formerly the Ottoman Empire? Was that a framework that you had growing up as you were an academic, as you were becoming a budding academic, and is it still the framework?
It's very interesting. I mean, the first question is, it is, well, the answer is not necessarily. In other words, when we were growing up, the Ottoman Empire was in the background somewhere, but I think the whole, I know the whole education and the way we were brought up with the understanding that this was something that we left behind.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing that we left behind, because it was something that really constrained what was then being thought of as a Turkish society. So it wasn't really, we weren't necessarily encouraged to think about Turkey in those kinds of historical terms. And if we were encouraged to think about it as something that was really almost like a 600-year accident in the longer term, broader history of Turks as such. Yeah. So breaking that actually really necessitated leaving Turkey and looking at this from a distance. And it is really, I always say this to, to my students, to my friends, we really had to really leave Turkey to understand Turkey in a thorough kind of way. So the Ottoman Empire came. So and now as I travel former parts of the Ottoman Empire, yes, I think there are a lot of things that I can see, and specifically because in Turkey, I am from Antakya. Which of course has a specific history of, being part of the Syrian mandate longer than the rest of the country, but culturally, historically, very much linked to what is now Syria and even further in the Arab world. So there is that kind of familiarity for sure. But when we were growing up, really, I think it would be very, we knew, and there were certain parts of the Ottoman Empire that we were supposed to be proud of, but overall, the notion was that it is something that is best sort of left behind. And as I'm sure you know, and a lot of the listeners know too, the most important part of this kind of break, of course, was changing the alphabet, changing the language, and not really having access to the sources, incredible amount of historical sources that are in the archives. And that was also a very important barrier. So that is, I think, I don't even know, perhaps some of the countries that went through revolutions in the 20th century, you may think about them in similar ways, but I don't really know any other country, I can't think of any other country that really instituted that kind of a radical break with its very recent history. So, yes.
It's really interesting because, like, even so the one of the books I have up on the page here, in 1997 published, "Rethinking Modernity and National Identity in Turkey." It almost suggests this like negative space, right? As if it's this
Yes.
map, and there's this positive space that's the focus of the book, rethinking this particular national identity without much time spent with the rethinking of all the other places' national identities, which brings me to something that we were talking about beforehand, which is even the complex nature of the phrase national identity. And this later work that I really want to talk about, a Movable Empire. If it's okay with you, do you mind if I just read this clip? So you say, furthermore, rather than figuring solely as a carriers of descent, in many instances, migratory and nomadic groups actually mediated and imposed the will of the imperial center. It was particularly intriguing that the economic, political, and social changes that the empire underwent in its long history, roughly 1300 to 1922, and the Ottoman state's repeated attempts to settle the tribes seem not to have affected the position and the prominence of tribal and other migratory groups. Tens of thousands of tribes, some encompassing thousands of people and animals, moved across great distances, cross-cutting the Ottoman Empire, which at one point extended from Algeria in the west to the Iranian border in the east, and from Crimea in the north to the Indian Ocean in the south. So this book, A Movable Empire, Ottoman Nomads, Migrants, and Refugees, I think, to me, helps me with this idea of like what a nation is, what a national identity might be, and the fluidity with which people cross those lines, particularly when an empire is so vast and it's in many ways borderless, and so people are sort of moving around. My question is, what surprised you about what in the process of writing this book? And what did it force you to reimagine or rewrite in your head when compared to the rest of what you knew about Turkey and what you knew about the Ottoman Empire? Because it seems to be a book that may be filled with surprises.
Yeah. Well, yes. I the very kind of I don't know, maybe the biggest conclusion, I must say, after working on this book and thinking about it, is the reversal of this very common assumption that shapes our thinking today. And not only our thinking, but of course, the entire sort of policy making in the world, in Europe, in the United States, all over the world. And that is the assumption that stasis, so the stability or stationary state of people living in fixed places with fixed identities, is the normal state of things. So movement then becomes something that is abnormal. It happens when it happens. It should be controlled. It should be stopped. It should be avoided. And then people who move consequently are abnormal people. So this is really, when you look at history in a longish term perspective, and that actually, I must say, that's also the result of my earlier training and this historical sociology, looking at these dynamics from a long-term perspective, you realize that actually stability, creating these institutions and borders and identities and passports, these are all quite recent. Really, it is something that grew and became widespread in the 19th century. And in this relatively short period of time, this kind of framework has really captured not only our imagination, but also our thinking about ourselves, about our world, and about other people. So I think breaking that and seeing this kind of nations are not normal, they're not really a manifestation of some eternal truth about a community of people, but they are not only constructed, they're constructed with very specific political goals in mind. I think really allows us to have much more of a dynamic understanding of our world. Now, I don't really mean to say, I don't mean to deny the fact that people who are now, in a state of migration or refugees, that they're not vulnerable, that they feel vulnerable, they need to be protected. And I fully understand why the desire to have a safe place to call home is something that everybody deserves and needs. That's the reality of our world. But I don't think this is, from a historical perspective, I really fully believe that a world that insists universally on staying in one place, within strict borders, beyond walls, a world like that, I think, ends up really making people a lot poorer than they can otherwise be. And I think that is really perhaps one observation that comes out of this book that I think is applicable to other contexts as well.
So the idea of stasis, so if you can sort of walk us through a little bit of the nature of the movement. So first of all, were the populations that were moving throughout this 600-year period always the same types of populations, or was it the cyclical thing where certain populations moved to new centers and ceased movement, and then behind them another group started moving, or was it there were stationary groups and moving groups?
Yeah. I think it is, it's more the latter. It's a dynamic process. There are if you look at it over the long-term perspective, and tribes, tribal movements of all kinds, this is a dynamic movement, and always it kind of occurs within the relationship between urban and rural areas of spaces. Ottoman Empire is a large space, obviously, but the same thing, obviously, you can observe in other places. So it is a dynamic relationship between urban and rural areas, and historically urban areas before nation states became the norm in terms of organization of communities in the world, urban areas always existed in their kind of desire, as a result of their desire to control rural areas. So that kind of dynamic is a power relationship. And these mobile groups, tribes, etc., provide that connection. So it is a dynamism that's a dynamic kind of originates from rural areas and eventually conflicts with urban areas, and oftentimes the urban areas really take over and really quote unquote sedentarize and civilize the tribal groups and mobile groups, but it's a dynamic. And one of the
Yeah.
best sort of explanations of this, of course, comes from Ibn Khaldun, as a North African. In many ways, I think could be thought about one of the very first historical sociologists looking at these long-term historical movements to explain what was going on at his time in his society. It was very much applicable to our times too.
Yeah. So you write, you say, in response to Ibn Khaldun, you say, Ibn Khaldun described tribes as entities bonded by strong feelings of solidarity based on lineage. The closeness of the ties that gave the tribes their unity also made them cohesive and powerful. As such, tribes were more effective than sedentary empires in fighting and spreading their influence. Can you give an example of what that might look like? Which tribes were more successful than these sort of sedentary empirical forces? What examples sort of reinforce that point?
There are when we talk about tribes as being these powerful, cohesive entities, what I was referring to is not to really idealize these structures as really one large family. The very well-established power relations that organize these communities. For our time, actually, the best really example, without going into specific tribes, the long-term sort of existence of Kurdish communities in eastern, southeastern Turkey and parts of, the Arab world and in Iran is a very good example, because if you think about it, you are talking about a community that has never had a state in the modern sense of the world. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but despite that, this is a community that spread across this geography has somehow maintained their core identity. And I think that is a very interesting question that we should think about. That's a very good example, actually, that really contrasts this, what we call the normality. But at the same time, of course, the power of the idea of a nation and a state is so strong that they, inevitably, of course, this has come to clash.
In the example of the Kurds, it's almost like they already have national identities without the statehood, and those are starting to clash, right?
Well, it is, yes. I think that's part of it, is definitely that, and you can think about that as in a way in reaction to the very strong national sort of policies of subjugation or making them more sedentary, etc., over many years. But despite that, I think what really the internal kind of dynamics of this is extremely, it's very different, very distinct, and I think it is very different from the norm.
I'm curious, and just from your perspective, like I was always very fascinated by the Hijaz Railway as Abdul Hamid II's, big national project to sort of unify this dying sort of dying empire and sort of rebrand it as the Muslim empire, right?
Yes.
In the places in sort of the Levant and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, Iraq, what are the legacies of the Ottoman Empire that still sort of are plain faced in front of you as somebody who studies this empire and that while it was alive and while in its sort of the ashes of the empire? What are the legacies of that influence that you still see as you travel around?
I think there is a certain element of sort of, the symbols of empire, and that really reflects itself in terms of some laws and architecture, some buildings, and elements of this, the Hijaz Railway you mentioned. Because it's really 19th century, Abdulhamid's period was also a period when, as an empire, there were a lot of things that were going on that tried to replicate what was going on in some of the new budding nation states in Europe in terms of centralization and control and having more of a, more of a connection, especially with the Arab world in the Middle East. So I think that spatial kind of, similarities, I think is really is important. But I think also for despite that period, the 19th century centralization, despite that period, one of the very interesting things about the Ottoman Empire is that it is not like the Roman Empire in a way. I mean, when you go across the sort of the Roman Empire, what was the Roman Empire, there are some things that you recognize everywhere: the highways, the roads, etc., columns and buildings. So there is this kind of almost continuing in a way decentralization that really allows a lot of local practices and cultures and languages to continue, but at the same time somehow maintaining through the local power structures, by co-opting the local power structures into a center, maintaining or preserving this empire for that very long period of time. So that kind of pull and push, I think, is important to keep in mind. So even though there are definitely traces and there are definitely similarities that you can recognize in the Balkans, especially in the Middle East, the Arab world, but unlike, as I said, some of the earlier empires, this is also an empire that managed to stay somewhat decentralized until the very end. So I think that makes it, one result of this has been, until recently, and I would say really the last maybe 20 years or so, in a way it still continues. There has been a unspoken division of labor between, let's say, the Balkan historians of the Ottoman Empire, Arab historians of the Ottoman Empire, and, I guess, for want of a better word, the Turkish historians of the Ottoman Empire. So it was really that you could actually do a history of the Ottoman Empire by only looking at Istanbul and the central institutions and do all kinds of things about it. And then similarly, the Balkans, etc. So it's only in the last 20 years or so we have a new generation of historians now who are much more aware of these ties that really needs to be taken into consideration. Even though this was a decentralized, this was still part of an empire. So I think that is something to keep in mind when we think.
Yeah, I find it to be such a I mean, this is a question we get all the time as afikra.
Yeah.
We hear things like, why did you choose to focus on the Arab world as opposed to the Middle East or as opposed to anything, right? And in the end of the day, it's an arbitrary decision, and it's just a preference for the stuff that we want to focus on. But I don't think I've ever heard, or maybe not ever, but I don't hear the term the former Ottoman, the sort of the area of the former Ottoman Empire as a useful demarcation of a group of people.
Yes.
And it's interesting that, like, if I grew up surrounded by Arabs and people from the former Yugoslavian Republic. And so a lot of folks from the Balkans and a lot of folks from the Arab world. And culturally, we clicked perfectly. And I never once thought to myself, well, we were all part of the same empire once upon a time. Is there something to that, or it's just we're geographically close and it doesn't matter?
I think there is. I think that's an important observation. I think there are a lot of reasons for this, and we can, there are different ways of thinking about it. But one aspect of it. When I said that this is, this was considering the fact that this is an empire that existed for a long time, etc. It was relatively light-handed in its dealings with different communities and parts. It's a huge geography. So many, non-Muslim religions survived throughout this period and continued to practice, etc. But at the same time, and I think there's some truth to this, and some of my colleagues that come from the Arab side of this historical profession are bringing this up, I think in a forceful way, and I think there's some truth to it, and that is the fact that this was an empire, basically. So there is an underlying power relationship. It was, there was a center, and center had its priorities, and they really imposed those priorities. So the give and take with the provinces really premised upon the assumption that the interests of the center would be served. Now, I think this became even more problematic in the 19th century because as the empire was trying to sort of centralize and copy some of Western practices in terms of creating state institutions, they also, I think, they were influenced by some of the, what was becoming in Europe at the time, imperialist, culturally sort of, colonial mentalities that were seeing the Europeans have in relationship to their colonies. So in other words, I think the Ottoman Empire became, at that time, its relationship with some of its provinces became problematic because these become, as the empire was becoming centralized, they become more and more really the subordinate, dependent, subservient sort of, so was seen as such by the center. And I think that kind of relationship, so it wasn't really, I think it would be unfair to think about this as a one very happy family that existed for 600 years in the common space. There were some periods, maybe it was closer to that, but overall, the power relationship, I think, is important to keep in mind. And this was, as I said, an empire that somehow managed to survive for 600 years. And that force, I think, was an important part of it. And of course, as we all know, it became increasingly more problematic within the context of 19th or the 20th century. Yeah.
Okay, well, there are a lot of questions in the chat. So we're going to do our little quick fire question before we get into stuff. So I'll try to keep you, to keep these quick. So the first question is, what are you reading or watching right now?
All right, so I'm reading a number of things at the same time. This is, I've been living in the United States now for a very long time, and all of us who are living in the United States are really fascinated, if that's the word, to see how this country, its institutions are unraveling very fastly. And And it is really, I think it is really incumbent upon us to try and understand what's going on. So I've been reading, a recent book I read is Jill Lepore's These Words, and that is really a 800-page history of the United States, but really that shows how race from the very, very beginning was there as an unresolved important issue that really has conditioned everything that's going on in this country. So it's a fascinating book that helps me quite a bit. Along the
Great.
same lines, but from my own profession, I read In God's Shadow, Alan Mikhail's book about Selim I, and really an interesting take about the European relations with the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. I read fiction also. I read Otessa Moshfegh's My Year of Rest and Relaxation, and that is that really. I mean, I try to read fiction that really take me away from what I do in my professional life, and that's a good one. In terms of watching, I'm watching this Danish series called Borgen. It's again it's done very well. It is about politics in Denmark, but really makes you to think about this relationship between executive and the press, etc. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Great. A lot of good stuff there. Okay. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
I have, rather than talking about one person, I just want to say the group, and I'm not going to identify them. These are the group of sort of people, the very end of the empire, and they're referred to as Young Turks, and then Atatürk, Mustafa Kemal came out of that group. I'm really fascinated thinking about these people trying to really not only understand what was going on, but to shape it in some ways. And a lot of them failed, some succeeded, some fell into opposition, but really that would be really fascinating.
Fantastic. What do people most misunderstand about your work?
Two things. When we were kind of thinking about this whole the empire, etc., it is really sometimes that can come across as really having a certain kind of attitude about modern Turkey, too critical maybe. Not really appreciative enough, if you want to think about it that way. And the same way when I wrote about modernity and modern identities, and that was sometimes interpreted as being too kind of supportive of the whole modernization project without really being critical about it enough. So I think it is sometimes they try to force you into this either side of this divide. Everything is polarized now, and I think that I think is something that sometimes bothers me.
Okay, great. And last question, whose work do you admire or are inspired by?
In terms of these historians who wrote really big books and forced me to think about the world in new ways, I want to mention Eric Hobsbawm and E.P. Thompson for different reasons, but they really are extraordinarily suggestive in their writings in terms of how we think about the world. In terms of Turkish history, Ottoman history, I think one of the most important people, I'm going to mention Sherif Mardin. He's a political scientist, but more of a sociologist, wrote about culture in 1960s and 70s, passed away just a few years ago. But really, when I look back at his work, it's really, it's very way ahead of its time.
Cool. Great. Okay, we have so many questions in the chat. So we are going to open up to everybody. So the order of the questions are Sarah, Crystal, Lutuf, Sam, Usman, and then Marianne. So please keep your questions short. And Resat, I'm going to try to ask you to keep your questions short as well. Your answers short as well. Sarah?
Thank you very much for receiving my question. I'm going to try to be concise. I'm Syrian and I live in Brazil. Here, the Syrian Lebanese community are referred to generally amongst a lot of other things as Turcos. And this makes sense, of course, given much of the immigration has taken place in the early to late 19th century and of course, a lot of them had Ottoman travel documents. Very little is known about the region today other than the fact that they came from the Ottoman Empire. But what is definitely known about this group of people here is that they are white. Racially, in Brazil, Syrian, Lebanese, Turcos are white. And what I wanted to know and what I'm curious about is what is it that facilitated or that could have facilitated this whitening process through which this immigrant community got consolidated in Brazil as they arrived, and which was very, very detrimental in the construction of what is called today racial democracy, which is a very, very oppressive ideology, racial ideology in Brazilian structure. Or more specifically about racial dynamics towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. Thank you.
This is a very good question. I'm not sure if I can really answer to your satisfaction, because a lot of it I think has to do with Brazilian history. From little I know, this may have to do more with the power structure in Brazil being keen on intent on maintaining the indigenous racial hierarchies intact and making sure, to the extent that's possible, the immigration that happened in the 19th century and the 20th century did not disrupt that. And somehow, and especially, I think that has something to do with it. So just to give you, I mean, this is can be a very long conversation, but ironically, there were at least several instances when I was a student in New York. People just wanted to assume that I was, just by virtue of coming from a poorer, underdeveloped country, that I should be a person of color in those kinds of conversations. So I think it has a lot of these have to do with local dynamics and local structures. And I don't think it is really the late Ottoman hierarchies were very different, and I don't think that really, I don't know if there is a direct relationship with that, but I think this is a very good question.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, Crystal?
Hello, merhaba. I wanted to ask, essentially, to keep it short, what would you identify Turkish people under? I know it's a complex question, as far as are they Arab? Are they I can't say right, Anatolian? And where do they also fit in like the Swana identity? Because, you know, part of it's like split in Europe. So I'm just curious.
What identity? I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. Which identity?
Yeah,
you said?
it's okay. Like what identity do, I guess, Turkish people fall under? Is it Anatolian? Is it Arab? What is it in the Swana identity? Especially since Turkey's like kind of cut in half. That's all.
Yes, it's you know, I mean, I think the best way of thinking about this is in terms of language. It's a distinct language, Turkish language. People who speak Turkish are very different from people who speak Arabic, and historical dynamics, where they originated, how they came from. It's a fairly well-known history, but origins of it is somehow mixed up, but it is not. So I think it is safe to think of, you know, some kind of an ethnic identity, but when you look at it closely, you also realize that there are a lot of overlaps and crosses. So I don't think it's useful to think about it as if it is a category that is unchanging. It's completely separate and insular. But in terms of culture, language, etc., it is a distinct group. I think that's a good way of thinking about it.
Lotaf, you ready?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Dr. Kasaba and Mikey and afikra for another interesting talk. Dr. Kasaba,
Can you raise your voice just a little bit? Sorry.
Yes. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Kasaba, at the beginning of your of the chat, you mentioned that you were encouraged to leave behind the part that is your past, being a part of the Ottoman Empire, if I understood you well. So I'm really curious to know why that is so. Although the Ottoman Empire had a really great impact or influence on the whole world for 5 or 6 centuries.
I think this is why one of Mikey's quick questions at the end, I said I want to kind of shadow these people at the very end of the empire. It is, it was the whole movement, the transition from the empire to Turkish Republic ended up being dominated by Mustafa Kemal, who later became Atatürk, who, was a very skillful politician, but he had some very strong ideas about what this new country should look like and what direction it should take. Why that happened and how it happened, these are all kind of really subjects for very long conversations. But I think he dominated that transition, and one of the decisions that he and his close friends made at the time was to really break this, introduce this radical break with the Ottoman Empire and ensure that the new country becomes almost exclusively oriented towards the West, towards Europe. So there was a deliberate policy of cutting those links with the recent history. And just very quickly, and the reason in their mind, I think the whole collapse of the empire, World War I, etc., were extraordinarily destructive, and they all had to do with some Ottoman institutions and the way the Ottoman Empire was trying to deal with those in the 19th century.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for your question. Sam, you're up next.
Thank you, Professor. This was interesting. I think you may have started to answer my question in the previous answer. But I was interested in knowing your take on Turkish politics. Although you said growing up, the Ottoman Empire was a past history, but do you feel that maybe some of the motivation of Turkish politics today has a mindset of wanting to reinstate some of that influence?
Yes. Yes.
Short answer, yes.
Yes. Well, I think it is. But again, just like I mentioned Atatürk as someone that's very strong opinions about how Turkey should move, etc. In Erdogan, President Erdogan, we have another very strong leader who has his own ideas about what Turkey should be and how its relations should be with its neighborhood, with the Middle East. And part of it does look like elements of reestablishing the Ottoman Empire. I honestly am not sure how detailed a vision this is in terms of the Ottoman Empire part of it, but I think there is that. It does look like that Turkey is a lot more active now all over the region, the Caucasus, Syria, Iraq, Libya, etc. And I must also say that some of this now in Turkey has to do with what's going on within the country, domestic politics of Turkey, and this is one way of deflecting, I think, the tension from some of the difficulties, domestic difficulties, and think about this regional vision, if you want.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Great question. We have two last questions, one from Usman and then one from Marianne. Usman?
Hello, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, got you.
So my question, Professor Resat, is about the 19th century. So in sort of the mid to late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire itself faced a large refugee crisis, we can say, where you had people pouring across into the empire from former territories across Central and Eastern Europe and other places. And I wanted to know, what do you think was the impact of having all of these refugees come into the Ottoman Empire and the earlier Turkish Republic? Because I think the Ottomans were even the first country to have a ministry dedicated to refugees. So I'm sort of wondering what the wider impact of all of that was.
It starts really mid-19th century. I think Crimean War is the first big kind of, it creates the first big wave of refugees. It had two, I think, two kinds of effect in what was going on in the empire in the 19th century. One has to do with identity. And in a way, these people were all either pushed out, and they chose to leave primarily because they were Muslims. They were pushed away by primarily Russia at the time and other powers. So they were coming to seek refuge in the empire. So dealing with this increasing waves of people, I think that really created that's the second effect. And that was institutions to somehow monitor them, settle them, manage them, had a very important effect in the creation of some of the early state institutions in the empire in the 19th century. And it is, it had over the rest of the century, of course, it had the effect of changing the religious ethnic composition of the empire in different parts of the world. It became part of this, almost like this ethnic engineering as we move into the late 19th century, settling them in areas and creating new synergies and new communities. So it's a very interesting story.
Great, thanks so much. Marianne, you'll be our last question, and then we will sign off.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. It's been really interesting, and I have been trying to follow the tracings of the diaspora out of the Mount Lebanon region. And of course, like what everybody has been saying, they're often identified, the people are often identified as Turks. Is there a way to backtrack? Is there an archive or a source that can kind of unravel the identities, the cultural identities of people now, so that I can at least get closer to what I'm hoping to find, which is more the narratives that are aligned with those cultural ties?
I only know this secondhand and thirdhand, other people's work, but two sources appeared. Well, I should say three, maybe. Family archives are turning out to be very interesting. It's something that I hope to do as well for my own family. So that is one. Depending on the family, the network, etc. But that is one source that people are using. The second is the religious documents, the church records, etc. And that's related to that. The missionaries who were all over the Middle East at the time, American missionaries, Protestant missionaries, their archives and documents are very rich. Most of them are in the United States. And then thirdly, specifically about the Armenians, of course, the orphanages that were set up in Syria and Lebanon, and those are also are turning out to be an interesting source in some research. Unfortunately, because the origins of this wave occurred at a time that was really, almost continuous war and destruction. Many of these are very hard to locate, but those I find, they're not really, they don't give you a sense of a whole community or a wave of migrants, but especially family archives are turning out to be very interesting stories about what people had to do to survive that period.
Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Marianne. Thanks to everybody. Professor Kasaba, thank you so much for joining us. This was really an honor to speak to you. And it's also a treat for us to be able to think about this from an Ottoman perspective and sort of broaden our horizon. So I hope you enjoyed being on the series.
I did. This is a really, thank you very much. And thank you for all the questions. And thank you for the very good work you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a nice day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. And thanks so much for all the questions.